Okay, so just by way of introduction, I think most people will be aware that Vera Hobhouse has been our MP in Bath since 2017, when she regained the seat that we had lost after Don Foster stood down. She was re-elected in 2019 with a majority of over 12,000, 54.5% of the vote, I think. And if I think I'm right in saying this was the best Lib Dem result we had last year. During her period in Parliament, she's probably been best known for her steering the legislation through on upskirting, despite the best efforts of Christopher Chope to talk the legislation out. She is currently our spokesman for the environment and climate change. I'm not sure people are aware of this, but I just checked with Vera before we started, and it is true that she began her married life in Liverpool. And what I didn't ask Vera is, did you come over to Wirral at all when you were there?
Oh, absolutely. It was just, you just had to go through the tunnel, and then off you went into the Wirral. Actually, William's relations lived in North Wales, so we went through it a lot. But also we ended up having some good friends on the Wirral. It's a beautiful place. It was obviously always, if I may say, the posher end compared to Liverpool. When we turned up in the 1990s, I was quite surprised how run down it was. And I came from somewhat prosperous West Germany, and I was surprised to find the very deprived areas of Liverpool, what we now called left behind. And then thanks actually to Liberal Democrats, it really has been completely transformed since the early 2000s. So that was a massive difference. But I was there when it was incredibly run down and very much militant Labour and all that. But all our 4 children were born in Liverpool. So we have very strong ties to the city and the area.
Well, you're hitting all the right notes so far there. That's very good. I could ask you to make an opening pitch and perhaps speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to some of the questions, if that's okay.
That's absolutely wonderful. Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. You might have just heard a great big thunderclap behind me, and I've just checked with Alan. Apparently, it's good where you are, the weather, but I felt, well, at least I'm not sort of dragging you inside when there's a beautiful summer's evening. Certainly here where I'm sitting, it's absolutely tipping it down. So thank you for your time this evening. That's really much appreciated. And I hope we're going to have a good discussion about the future of the party and the future of your fortunes where you are. But obviously we are now in the leadership contest, and I will start with the pitch why I think I want to stand and why I'm different. So first of all, I believe that actually we need to make a very clean break from the coalition. I was surprised how Joe, who I supported, was still really haunted by the coalition years. And I think for us to really make progress, we need to make a very clean break from the coalition, and we need a candidate and a leader who's not associated with a coalition. Secondly, I have got a long experience in local government. The one thing that you left out, Alan, was that actually I was a councillor for 10 years in Rochdale. So we lived in Liverpool for nearly 10 years, and then we moved across into Lancashire and lived in Rochdale for 15 years. And I was a councillor there. So I'm a strong champion for local government. We took control of the council in 2006. We lost it again in 2010. But my local government experience is actually one of the things that informs a lot of my thinking and what I think where the party should be going and where I think our DNA is, and that is as local campaigners and local activists and strong champions for local democracy. And then one of the things that's already been mentioned, I'm now the MP for Bath, but I have lived and been actively involved in politics in other areas of the country. And again, I think it's actually a strength if one has seen other areas than one's immediate patch, because we, as much as things unite us, we are also different and we have different priorities. And I believe it is very important for the next leader to recognize that our regions, our different local areas need different answers to some of our political challenges. And I believe as much as we need a strong central message, we need particularly strong local messages, and we should give local areas the freedom to shape their own destiny when they campaign. And last but not least, I call myself a hard liberal. My political interest actually started all the way back in Germany, where I grew up, and I was active as a student in the 1980s. And then the threat to liberalism came from communism. And I always understood that you don't compromise with intolerant and authoritarian tendencies. You have to fight them and defeat them. And the threat to liberalism now comes from the right. It becomes increasingly intolerant. If you look at Brazil or the US or other right-wing countries with right-wing leaders, but the UK is not far behind. And when we are talking about cooperation, fair enough, but it has to stop at some point where, unless we are very careful, we are losing our liberal values, our rules-based order, the things that we have been taken for granted for such a long time in this country. And I simply think there is no question of working together. For me, there is a line where one has to actually just defeat these tendencies and these political parties that are representing them. So in that way, I call myself a hard liberal. I think sometimes we're a bit soft and we like cooperation, we like to build social consensus. That's all well and good, but there are things that we need to actually fight. It is very difficult to meet intolerance with tolerance, because we end up in an intolerant country. So that's my basic pitch. I think we need to be with our feet firmly in a center-left ground. I have been campaigning for a progressive alliance. I think that's our way forward. I believe that one of the most important challenges for the next generation is the climate emergency, and we will be defining what liberalism is, I think, in our response to the climate emergency. So these are a few strands that I put out there, but it is your evening, and I'm listening to your questions and will answer them as best as I can.
Thank you very much, Wera. Just to remind people, when I call you to speak, if you can just unmute yourself, that's the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. So I'm going to put two questions together to start with, which both on the transport theme. Chris Teggin and Peter Reisdorf have both submitted questions about different aspects of transport. So Chris, I see you've just joined us. Are you ready to put your question?
Thanks, Alan. Hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Oh yeah, we can hear you.
Right. My question is that the changes provoked by the coronavirus restrictions are having profound impacts on travel. Some positive, some negative, and they'll probably be with us for a long time. How should we as a party be responding to the challenges and opportunities, particularly at the local level, with regard to car use and public transport?
Thank you. And Peter?
Peter, yep. Can you unmute yourself, Peter? That's it.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I'm asking this question is I bumped into someone I know who works for our local train operator, Merseyrail, a few days ago. He said it is effectively insolvent, and the firm that runs the franchise, Dutch Railways, is getting a subsidy from the government to carry on. He also said that he thinks the current level of service, basically a Sunday service, except starting about 6 a.m, could go on for years. That means a half-hourly service on the line that I usually use to commute instead of quarter-hourly. Even with some people continuing to work from home or walking or cycling to work, this is going to mean a very big increase in the number of people driving to work. This will be disastrous for the planet. What can we do to get people back on public transport?
Thank you. Well, both of your questions are incredibly relevant, and indeed, I have put my mind as a spokesperson for climate action. I have put my mind to that, and I'm leading a climate cluster, well, in Parliament or from Parliament. But the beauty, of course, about coronavirus and remote working is that I get far more people like you tonight, far more people into a room than if they all had to travel into London on a Tuesday morning. So we had a very increased participation of councillors from across the country, and we have been putting our mind to exactly these questions. And you're absolutely right, Peter. The problem is that as much as people who have stayed at home and were in lockdown have experienced the beauty of fresh air and no cars, and you can hear the birds sing, and you can appreciate much cleaner air. As soon as we get out of the corona lockdown, a lot of people will jump into their cars because public transport is deemed to be not safe. And while the Prime Minister has said, well, we want to encourage walking and cycling, this is not always possible. And there's a great big challenge. You're absolutely right, Peter. But let's just talk about the opportunities that we have, certainly for shorter distances and shorter distance travel. And that is where I've been trying to be active in Parliament to make sure that local authorities get the powers to increase pavements and take road space away in order to make cycling and walking a lot safer, but also give much more space to them, so that ultimately we are taking the ability to drive around in cars, particularly in our urban areas, away and gently get people used to in urban spaces or in our towns and villages, where they can actually appreciate what the public space that we regain by this, also much less noise, is just so much more pleasant, and encourage people to walk and cycle more. The biggest barrier to walking and cycling is always cars, because people are not feeling safe. So these opportunities of creating much safer routes locally for walking and cycling are absolutely there. Indeed, I've been writing to the Secretary in the DFT Grand Chaps and the Prime Minister to make it possible that local authorities in particular can have the powers to take road space away, to give it over to cyclists and walking. What can we do about trains? I think that is indeed a very big challenge. Obviously, currently the recommendation is that people now have to wear face masks. I mean, in the end, everything will come down to price. And if you're talking about massive subsidies that these train operators receive, then that has to be reflected in the ticket price as well. So one of the big arguments where people say they don't use public transport is it's very expensive, and it absolutely is. So the challenges are to make train travel competitive, make trains reliable. Another thing that public transport always faces as a criticism is that it's not reliable, and that's why they're not using it. So train companies really need to deliver on price and regularity, and ultimately making traveling by car less attractive, but also slightly more restricted in our urban areas, in our inner city areas, in our towns, in our villages.
Thanks, Vera. The next question really follows on from that, and it's from Phil Waterfield, and he's going to take up the issue of electric cars, I think. Phil?
Yes, hi, thanks, Alan, and hi, Wera. I've got a couple of questions here about, it's more about climate change, and I know this is one of the areas that you're responsible for. So in the future, I'm assuming that the UK would like to see a substantial replacement of fossil fuels with electric cars, and that's starting now. But there are two consequences that I can see. First, if there are to be a lot of electric cars on the road, there's going to have to be a major investment in roadside or household charging points. And you can imagine this is going to cost a very large amount of money to go up and down every road and every cul-de-sac in the country, putting charging points in on people's electric. And second, does the UK actually have enough electricity generating capacity to actually supply this power in the evening when everyone gets home and plugs their cars in? So given the very poor efficiency of burning fossil fuels to make power, to make electric power, has anyone actually done the cradle to grave calculations about whether these cars are actually truly more economically friendly? So
two very good questions. So first of all, you're absolutely right. We need to prepare the grid in order to take the increased demand in electricity. And people, there's experts who are putting their minds to that, and they're looking at a sort of 3 to 4 times increased capacity, and that absolutely needs lots of infrastructure investment. And as one of, I think from BMW last year, I talked to a representative from BMW, and they said, do you remember the times when you put on your kettle, your washing machine, and then also your dishwasher, and bang, the whole thing, the fuse tripped. So there's also an issue about our local interchange and interconnectors. So there's a lot of investment that needs to be put in there, and people are very much aware of it. If we talk about the investment that we need to have in order to adapt to getting to net zero as soon as possible, the issue is always, and Stern said it, I think 10 years ago, doing nothing will cost us a lot more. So the investment is necessary, and we got to do it, because not tackling the climate emergency will lead to catastrophic climate disaster, and we know it will lead to massive global inequalities, and that will affect us here. Whether the climate emergency is as catastrophic here as it might be in the southern hemisphere is a different issue, but to have to face a huge global unrest because massive migration and the pressure on countries where people will move into, all of that would create a world, even if we survive as human beings, which is questionable, even if we survive, would we really want to live in a world with such massive conflicts, and what would all of that cost us? So responding now to the climate emergency and making those investments, particularly because we know what to do. It's not this is a new thing and we don't really know what to do. We actually absolutely know how to respond to the climate emergency. And it doesn't have to be just with electric vehicles. The future is not just via electricity and solar panels. There are solutions to let hydrogen take quite a lot of the load. So particularly,
hydrogen cars would be my thing. Mm.
Well, I think the way the sort of the industry and the experts sees it is hydrogen is particularly good for heavier vehicles and for trains and for public transport and buses, because otherwise the batteries that you need, the size of the batteries would be very, very large, and that would make each vehicle very, very heavy. So the expectation is that that hydrogen would be particularly good for buses, trains, lorries, the heavier vehicles, while the electric solution is for our private vehicles. But can we all continue to use our cars as before? I don't think so. So this is why, going into a future where we continue to have the same level of private car use is probably not desirable, and we should try to stop that. Coronavirus might help us to look and see the world differently, that quite a lot of meetings and getting together actually doesn't have to involve physical meetings. So we might travel less in the future, but also we need, of course, continue to press for much more walking and cycling. Young people actually want to cycle independently or want to walk independently to school. It's just parents were scared to let their children walk or cycle to school because of safety issues, are one of the big issues to tackle. In Bath, we have got a massive pollution issue. And it is because actually mostly because of the school run. As soon as we've got school holidays, the roads are much less congested. So a lot of it is about individual car use. Quite a lot of it is actually related to school travel. There is a lot we can do.
Yes, I used to live in Bath for 7 years, and I know how hilly it is. And cycling around Bath is a tough challenge.
I've got an electric bike.
Oh, that's cheating.
No, I still have to pedal. But people say it's expensive. It's true. But with all of these things, obviously prices come down, and the more people are buying electric bikes. It is a luxury. I accept that. But I sold my car, so I have replaced something with it. A lot of people will say an electric bike doesn't replace a car, but if you are a family of 2 cars like we were, it has definitely got rid of our second car, and that's at least something.
Thank you, Vera. That's a really good answer. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Wendy Jones has submitted a couple of questions, but she's got asthma this evening, so she's asked me to read them on her behalf. Is that still the case, Wendy? Yep, okay. Again, the first one, back on the environment. We're just coming out of an extraordinary period of business change. There is some talk that this will be a great opportunity to reset the business agenda for the good of the planet. What's your view on this? And how can we capitalize on the opportunity presented rather than just go back to the old ways of working?
Wendy, a very, very good question. And I couldn't agree more that that has to be our ambition, but it is a big challenge. And that's of course why you're asking that question. And if I had the answer, I would probably be on a world tour of telling people what to do. I think the ambition for everybody on the planet is ultimately to have a green recovery. So not going back to the old normal, but creating a new normal. And since that has to happen very quickly, and while it is also connected to a lot of politicians wanting to bring the economy back to at least as near as possible pre-COVID state, it will be a massive challenge. And the temptation is to ultimately just invest money where people already know what they're doing, rather than think and pause and invest the money into the right green, the green future that we all need. And as Lord Deben, who's the chair of the Committee for Climate Change, said on Radio 4, I think the other day, it would be completely foolish to restart the economy, going back to something before COVID, not with the green recovery in mind, and then in 5 or 10 years' time need to make all that investment to actually get us on the transition to net zero. We Liberal Democrats have got a very clear plan. We want to cut most emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2045. That means we need to start doing that transition now. At the basis of what we are saying is it's got to be a just transition, so those who can least afford it should not pay the highest price for it. So it is about how government will support those who cannot afford the transition and the adaptation of their homes, on the insulation and the changing of their boilers and whatever it is. So we need to start looking at government support for households who can least afford it. But also, as we have already discussed, government needs to make huge investments into infrastructure changes, into grid improvements, but where it, for example, starts to support big industries like the aviation industries, that support, and they're pouring eye-watering amounts of money into the recovery of, for example, the aviation industry, which is going to struggle in the future. That has to be a condition, it has to be tied towards forcing the industry ultimately to start the transition to synthetic fuels, so that flying will become net zero in the next 20 years. And that can be done. Again, I've been talking to some experts, people who know a lot more about it, but it sounds a very plausible a way of doing this. Blending kerosene with synthetic fuels is perfectly possible. People know how to do it. Yes, it will also put an extra cost on the ticket sale, but ultimately it can be done. And if we take the climate emergency seriously, and if we want climate action now, that's what a government that takes the climate emergency seriously can do and should do. And that's what gets us onto the right path to a net zero future.
Thanks very much, Vera. We're going to move to a different topic now. Alan Brighouse has put in a question about law and order.
Yes, thanks, Alan. Hello, Vera. My question is very much to do with the progressive alliance that you are you're advocating and keen to promote, and it's how we tackle the Conservatives. And the question is, the Conservatives believe that the public will support a party that is tough on immigration, tough on law and order, and tough on Brexit. What is the alternative, and how, more importantly, how do we promote it?
Thank you, Alan. So first of all, we have seen how the Conservative campaign. They campaign on very quick and sharp slogans, because many people don't ultimately have a lot of time for politics. We all have a lot of time for politics. We go into the details and we put our mind to things. And I assume that most people in this Zoom room know that Brexit is going to be not what the Conservatives have promised, but it sounded simple and easy: get Brexit done and take back control. These sort of short, sharp messages is something that people resonate with. And I think one of our problems as Liberal Democrats, because we actually like to be evidence-based, and because we like to have thought through things, and because we understand that actually the world isn't that simple, and sometimes issues like tackling the climate emergency, that cannot be done by a simple slogan. We end up explaining a lot of what we are doing, and we need to be sharper about our messages. And that is ultimately about, you know, a bit of our marketing, a bit of the people that we employ in HQ and in our local areas who are working for the Liberal Democrats, to actually find these short, snappy messages that reflect what we believe in. And that is a simple marketing thing, to be quite honest. So politics is about selling your ideas to people and making them convincing. And sometimes I think we tend to be too complex and complicated. And that is on our local focus leaflets, but that is also about bigger national messages. So I'd say some of that is just simply how we message our stuff. But then about the single issues and how do we actually get the support that we need in order to win elections. And we will never beat the Tories by being like the Tories. And we will need to persuade people to ultimately see where the flaws in the Conservative messages are. So get Brexit done. Well, we are seeing already that getting Brexit done is something that's not going to happen. So quite a lot of the Brexit message is probably going to unravel anyway. We know why people voted for Brexit, because they were very unhappy, and many so-called left behind or held back communities felt very aggrieved with the establishment politics, and they hope that Brexit will give them a better future. When all of that is not going to be fulfilled, probably quite a lot of those people who voted for Brexit will be sorely disappointed. So therefore, I'm in that sense not particularly worried about the Brexit message. We are now going to Brexit. That's unfortunate. I try to fight Brexit with all my might. We are now leaving the European Union, or have left the European Union. But I think the coming years will probably show that the Conservatives cannot deliver on their Brexit messages. So I would just let it play itself out, to be quite honest. Brexit is going to not be what has been promised. I can guarantee you that. On law and order, I'd say one of the things where actually Britain, compared to, for example, America, has actually been very good about is that a lot of our policing and a lot of keeping the law of the land enforced is by consent. We've also seen that through coronavirus. Actually, policing and abiding by the law is much more successful if people actually want to do it and do it voluntarily, rather than that you have to enforce it and become ultimately a police state and see what happens in countries where you're tough on law and order. It actually just provokes more violence. So I think a tough message on law and order is not very British. I don't think it works, and I think actually the message of that we are rules-based and a country based on people wanting to abide by the law because the law works for them is probably the best message that we can get out there. So people need to understand that law and order is for them and not against them. And one of the big things that I find a tragedy is the undermining of the welfare state that has meant that a lot of people don't get access to justice. So when people feel that the justice system, the law of the land is for them, I don't think we need to become, a country doesn't need to become a police state in order to enforce the law. and again, I think we Liberal Democrats have got much better messages on law and order than that just is a tough enforcement on the law of the land, which only leads to protests and people ending up spraying bullets and tear gas. That's how I see where we stand. Don't worry about Brexit. I think the tough message on law and order is not what actually resonates with people. I think what resonates with people is to see that we want the law of the land to work for people. We want people to have access to justice, and we want people, as we have seen in the COVID crisis, a vast majority of people to abide by the law and police by consent.
Thank you very much, Vera. Well, I'm now going to hear a voice from the other end of the House, because Elizabeth Brain is going to put a question to you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, thank you. Right, I'm asking this question, Vera, at a time when in Germany theatres are about to reopen after the lockdown. But many people in Britain, up and down the country, have taken great comfort in the arts during the lockdown. How can we as a party support people working in the arts moving on? And I'm hoping that you're not going to say that we will squash the arts alongside sports and hope any problems in the arts will just vanish, as Labour and Tories have been doing for decades. Thank you.
A wonderful question. I represent Bath, which thrives on the hospitality and cultural sector. And I am engaged with lots of arts organizations in Bath. And you've just had an arts conference. Actually, my background is in the arts. I trained as a painter, actually. So I've got a arts degree, a fine arts degree from Berlin. So, and you know, I can't see my life without culture in it. So the arts and cultural sector is personally very close to my heart. And yes, how do we support the arts sector? The problem I have found, and it's going to go back decades, since we've got a department that is a department for culture, media and sport. Actually, it's media and sport and where most of the attention and most of the resources go into. And culture is something that is tagged onto it. And I think at some point, in order to draw attention to the sector, we either need a government that actually values culture and the arts and theatre, and have a separate culture and arts department. But in the meantime, all I can do, and I do, is write to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and keep pressing for the importance of the cultural sector, and point out how important for people's mental health it has been that the arts are around. And indeed, that's probably one of the things where we can achieve most, where we are connecting the arts also very much to a well-being agenda, where we understanding that culture has to be part of a curriculum. So making sure that arts, that's music and creative arts and dancing and performance continues to be part of education, which has also been squeezed out. These are the things where we need to continue to campaign as Liberal Democrats, as those who enjoy and value the arts, and make sure that it doesn't just become a domain for the privileged and for the wealthy. Because if you don't pay attention, then suddenly arts is something that only the rich people can afford, and it absolutely shouldn't be that.
Thank you very much, Vera.
Yeah, I mean, I see it very much as an equality issue as well. More and more, if you don't actually have arts education at school, if you don't actually invest in young people who, for example, cannot afford to have an instrument, you know, all these sort of funding cuts that have been made to music centers and so on and so forth. More and more, we are just squeezing out young people out of a part of life that is incredibly important, that we need in order to feel good as people, whether we are rich or poor. So for me, it's also very much an equality issue.
Indeed. I think many of us appreciate just how much we value the arts, but now we're deprived of them to some extent. I missed Adam's question before. I should have slipped it earlier in the order. Adam's going to ask a question relating more back to our transport topics earlier. Could you, yeah. Adam, we can't hear you.
Hello, Liverpool Air.
Yeah,
In the
okay.
pipeline for.
Could you start again, Adam?
You can hear me, can you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure thing. Plans for extending Liverpool Airport have been in the pipeline for some years, threatening the destruction of Oglet Shore. Should the party be unequivocal in its condemnation of economic investments and investors that have a detrimental impact on the climate and our biodiversity?
Adam, I encourage you, and in fact everybody, to read our excellent policy that we developed over the last year. And I was part of that as a spokesperson for climate action. It's an 80-page document, but it's easy to read, I think. But you can also pick out the things that you want to particularly know about how we tackle the climate emergency. It says in our plan to get to net zero, it says very firmly, we will not support any expansion of airports unless there is an alternative to jet fuel, and the industry, the aviation industry, flies on fuels that are net zero. And as I've already said at the beginning, it's perfectly possible. It's there. It's actually not. It's not that we condemn flying. We will be probably flying a lot less, at least in the next year or two, anyway. I'm not against flying. Flying is a wonderful thing. What is not great about flying is that it creates. It's a massive contributor to global warming and CO2 emissions. But as soon as we take that bit out of flying, then I don't see why we shouldn't fly. Same with heating our homes. As soon as it's net zero, it's fine. We should live in warm homes. As soon as flying is done on fuels that are net zero, for me, there's nothing wrong with flying. So let's make sure the aviation industry moves and transitions to synthetic fuels. It can be done. It can be blended. There's a mechanism, as I have understood now, which is called the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. It's there. Government could be very tough on the industry and impose that. It could also, and that's for all internal flights, because a lot of the time the argument against any change is, oh yeah, but it needs international agreements. It can then become part of international agreements, again through the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. It can also be part of COP26, that we get international agreements on how we are transitioning into synthetic fuels. It doesn't cost the earth. It doesn't mean new engines. It doesn't mean new aeroplanes. As I understand it, it would increase a ticket that costs £100 to £160. That is more, but again, it's not an unbelievable, eye-watering sum of money. Buying air tickets, plane tickets shouldn't be cheaper than buying train tickets, and it's absolutely absurd that I can fly to Berlin, for example, for a third of a price than taking a train up to Manchester from London. I mean, it's ridiculous. So
Hi, Wera.
let's go that way. Yeah.
Wera,
Can I finish? All right, Phil. Just to follow up very quickly on that point.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier, I think when taking Wendy's question, that it would take about 20 years to get to net zero. But most of the estimates, most of the scientists suggest that the tipping point, the planetary tipping point, is 2030, which is 10 years away. So I suppose the sort of the subtext to my question is the urgency there? And should we be taking a more hardline approach in dealing with investors when considering the climate crisis?
So the plan that we set out, and I'm really very much behind what we have developed, is most emissions by 2030. So it's not ambitious, it's most emissions, but it takes into account some difficult sectors. So the whole plan, if you read it, is broken down in sectors. So it's surface transport, it's heating, it's electricity, and so on and so forth. And then aviation, agriculture, and then a bit that we call negative emissions. So we know even if we do everything, in order to stop warming to go above 1.5 degrees, we need to do what is called negative emissions. And that means ultimately taking existing emissions out of the atmosphere, which is why, you know, for all parties actually propose very big tree planting programs, rewilding, reinstatement of bogland and peatland and all the rest of it, but also what is called well, it involves carbon capture and storage. So it basically means that you're taking CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere but via a technology that hasn't been fully developed, and store it back in carbon capture under, you know, in great big rocks under the sea. That's part of our Lib Dem plan. And these things take longer than 10 years. And for that reason, we have always said, you know, that you can always say, oh, we should do it by 2030, but can we do it at 2030? No, we can't. We can take most emissions out by 2030 if we're really ambitious, but to get to net zero, we currently, as Lib Dem say, it's 2045. I wonder whether we could bring it forward to 2040, but but while being ambitious, it's also realistic, and that's what we are as a party. And I think, we want to be taken seriously by the industry and the people that we want to work together, and businesses, because other than, for example, the Green Party or the Labour Party, we actually want to harness the power of enterprise and businesses to work with them to find the solutions for getting to net zero. We are not anti-business as Liberal Democrats. We believe in good regulation and using market mechanisms to get there, but not to just go back to the caves. And I think and that's, I think, where we're also good against the Green and the Labour Party. You know, we don't want to go back to the caves. The Green Party just says, let's stop flying. Well, it's not going to happen. Let's be realistic and evidence-based. We can do it. We can do it with realistic proposals, but also with a realistic target. And so far, we've said 2045, but no later than that.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Phil.
No, it's all right. I know.
That's fine. Now, it was just a thought that, you know, the global aviation industry uses hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel oil, hundreds of thousands, probably more, hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel oil. But to replace that with synthetic oil, we're going to need a huge amount of agricultural land to make that oil.
No, it's. I think synthetic fuels are not biofuels, so they are derived in a chemical way that are not carbon zero. And don't ask me the specifics of this because I'm not a chemist. But I think you're getting slightly.
Yeah, well, I am a chemist.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, well, I am a chemist, and I'm thinking, you know, to have that source fuel, you're going to have a large amount of alkane fuels, alkane source material to make that. And you're talking about.
It's hydrogen and carbon dioxide, so it's a different thing than what I think you're having in mind. But I'm because this becomes very technical now. I think we might have to migrate the question and that argument to an email discussion, and I'm happy to do that. But I think we're too much into the detail here.
Fair enough. We're going to move on away from specific policy areas now to slightly more general points. First of all, I'd like to bring in Mike Parsons, who's got a question for you. Mike.
Hello. Hi, Wera. Thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate that. My question is, obviously, we're currently still in the middle of the corona pandemic, and obviously we've just had a general election. However, if the coronavirus was contained and we were about to have a general election, what do you think the key Lib Dem message should be to the electorate?
My key message would be we need to defeat the Tories. I believe the threat to liberalism comes from the right. So that's why I believe we can only defeat the Tories because by forming a progressive alliance. That's well recognized by Labour as well. Most of the seats that we can win where we are in a credible second place are against the Tories. There are a handful of seats where we are up against Labour, and we need to find an arrangement with the Labour Party, on messaging, but also in terms of campaigning, where not necessarily a formal arrangement of standing down. That's certainly not going to happen in the next year, but where we are finding an arrangement where we are fighting hard against the Tories, but we don't fight hard against Labour, certainly in the seats that we want to win from the Tories and where the Labour and where the Labour Party needs to defeat the Tories in many northern seats. So we need to have an understanding that we will not defeat the Tories if the progressive centre-left keeps splitting itself in elections. And I've said it in several forums now. I believe actually Britain is a progressive country, but we keep ending up and have in the last 10 years ended up with a right-wing government. We were in coalition at some point with them. We had hoped that would be a way of actually toning down the Conservatives, but look where we are. We have ultimately facilitated a very right-wing agenda. All that has happened in 2015, or all that has happened after 5 years of coalition government, we were destroyed by the Tories, our friends. They have basically almost destroyed us. So I don't see any ways of working together with the Tories at all. We need to defeat the Tories. We need to defeat the threat to liberalism from the right. We need, if we ever want to win, a progressive alliance, and we need to win with Labour. And when Labour's doing well, look back at the years with Paddy Ashton and Charlie Kennedy, we are doing well when Labour's doing well. So firing all our shots also against Corbyn in the last general election was a massive mistake. And we ended up with the same number of seats in 2019 as we did in 2017. So if we want to make progress, we need to be firmly with both feet in the progressive left camp of British politics, and that's where our heart beat anyway. And you know, we share a lot of messages with Labour. We shouldn't be afraid to differentiate ourselves with Labour. I think we are also a very different party, but our values, our long-term outlook is on the progressive left, and that's what we should do. And that would be my central message.
That's very interesting, because we've got two questions coming up which are already touching on the same area, one from Roy Wood and then one from Lucy Johnson. So could I ask Roy to come in first?
Hi, Vera. Yeah, I mean, following on from what you've just said, it isn't the logic of that just not campaigning hard against Labour isn't enough, that we would actually have to stand down in seats where Labour can win, providing they were prepared to reciprocate so that we could win. The idea that we would just probably go gently against them or try to share policies, I'm not sure that would be electorally beneficial.
Well, it did actually work between 1997 and 2004. 2005. So there were never formal arrangement between Tony Blair and Paddy Ashton, for example, but there was a sort of mutual understanding, and more could come out of this. It isn't just about standing down; it's also about finding joint messaging, and, for example, going into an election where proportional representation was something that the Labour Party would stand on in their manifesto. For me, that would be, for example, a very important thing, because we cannot continue like this and splitting ourselves because we've got a very unsatisfactory voting system. So for me, one of the things that I would hope, obviously, if there was a general election tomorrow, it would be more difficult, but we hopefully do have time until 2024, where we're discussing these things, what is in it for us, apart from that we should together win a lot more seats and defeat the Tories. So the ideal scenario would, of course, be that we are going to stand down for each other. When we did this, actually, with the Greens, it didn't prove particularly popular with the voters. So I think we have to be careful not to then put voters off. So I think informal arrangements are probably much more likely. The question is whether we should stand down in order to show willing, while Labour is not standing down. So Rosie Duffield was a good example, where actually one of our Lib Dem PPC said, you know, I'm just going to stand down for the Labour candidate, and I don't mind whether it's reciprocal. So they're the three options. I mean, ideally, yes, we are standing down for each other. We have to be practicing a little bit careful whether that actually would backfire, because the electorate would really not like it. And also, I don't think it is going to happen. So I think the more likely scenario is that we are going to just, in informal arrangements, tone down campaigning, and there's a very good understanding who is actually going to win, rather than firing, setting the fire on each other, like we, for example, did in North East Somerset in my neighbouring seat, and then the Tories come through, and now we've got Jacob Rees-Mogg. You know, these sort of things we need to wake up to, and the Labour Party has woken up to. And the third option would be that we are standing down for Labour. I'm not entirely certain whether that is that last option is particularly satisfactory. The Greens have done that for us in the 2017 election, and it was became very unpopular within the Green Party. So I think the most likely scenario is what I said before, an informal understanding of very toned down campaigning, where it is clearly understood whether Labour is in second place, or whether we are in second place, or in the few seats where the Greens might in second place.
Okay, and perhaps Lucy would like to come in with her question. Vera, Lucy actually works in Tim Farron's office.
Okay.
Yeah, so I got a bit of experience with kind of going up against the Tories with Tim, but my only issue is that the local party on the Wirral, as you probably know from living in Merseyside, is that Labour are our main opposition. So I'm just wondering how you'd work with local parties such as ours, where we really are kind of facing such a solid Labour vote. So
the Progressive Alliance argument is for a general election. I always say that. So it's our long-term way of defeating the Tories. But of course, we have got local elections. And I said in my opening pitch, I very much appreciate the importance of local government. We need to, as a party, build from the grassroots up. It's about grassroots campaigning. And here, of course, you know, it's whoever you're up against, you want to defeat your main enemy. I mean, on the Wirral, as I understand it, we're in third place with 6 councillors. I'd first try and take the Tories out, to be quite honest, and then become really the main opposition against Labour. But of course, we're going to fight Labour as well. And how do we fight other parties, particularly at local level? Is because we always provide, in the end, the best local councils, because we believe in local government, local campaigning, local community, and community activism. And we are the best at local government. And when we do have power and where we do run councils, they're often the best run councils. And the one thing that has really aggrieved me in 2010, when I was a councillor in Rochdale, so across the road, basically, and we had been running Rochdale Council, a big metropolitan borough council. We were running up to a point Liverpool City Council. We were running Sheffield Council. And then the message was, oh, for the first time in 70 years, we're going to be in government. I thought, what? We've been in government at local level in many, many places. And why should we sacrifice local government on the altar of national government? So I believe our rebuilding definitely happens from the local levels up, from local government level up. We should not be ashamed to be the best at local government and build our party from the grassroots up, and absolutely fight the Labour Party in your local areas and demonstrate that you're the best at the best community campaigner and the best local councillors.
Thanks, Vera.
I think we've probably got time for one final question. It's from David Evans. I can see his picture's not there, but are you there, David? No. Okay, I'll ask the question for him, if I may. The Liberal Party or Liberal Democrats have historically done best with charismatic leaders like Charles Kennedy, Paddy Ashdown, Joe Grimmond, and even Jeremy Thorpe. In an age when personality politics is more prevalent than before, how will you raise the profile for Lib Dems in a competitive arena?
So is politics about a charismatic leader, or is it about the best policies? It's probably a bit of a combination. And as a leader, you also become stronger as you are the leader. So I would hope to be definitely a passionate campaigner for whatever I stand for. And I was a passionate anti-Brexit campaigner, probably the the hardest nosed of us all in the parliamentary party. I'm a passionate environmental campaigner. What people say about me when they know me, and some people know me better than others, that I'm genuine, and I think that's how I want to conduct my politics, whatever you label that, whether that's charismatic. I think the best way of winning is if we as a party come across as genuine, genuinely believing in things, genuinely also being hard-nosed about our enemies, and I've said that out at the beginning as well. I think it is about a clarity of vision, a clarity of where we want to go, a clarity that I wouldn't want to compromise on the climate emergency and on climate action. These sort of things, if you set them out as clear policies, I don't think it matters much whether you've got brown hair or blonde hair or whatever you call charismatic. Charisma comes with a set of beliefs and a passion to want to see them implemented and be uncompromising. That's certainly the things that I personally stand for. I do believe, of course, in listening to people, but from certainly my local government experience where we were in government, sometimes you just have to lead. You have to show, here's my proposals. I listen to people's concerns. One can, of course, with a vision, go and tweak and make it better and so on and so forth. But if you listen and listen and listen and get sort of messed up by too many opinions, you just go nowhere. So leadership is important. The lack of leadership during getting us through the coronavirus crisis, I think is an excellent example of what you shouldn't do. So it's about showing leadership. It's about being listening, but also knowing where you want to go. Sorry, I now need some water.
I think your voice is just picking up at the right moment. Can I thank you on behalf of all our members here for responding so eloquently to all the questions which were thrown at you with no advance warning. So it's very much appreciated, and I'm sure we all wish you all the best in the forthcoming leadership campaign, and thanks for making a start here on Wirral.
Well, thank you very much to everybody for joining us tonight, and let's keep that discussion going.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.